Welcome to the Past Unveiled, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now beginning Story 1, Life and Labor of the Medieval Housewife. You find yourself in a thatched hut on a foggy morning in 13th century rural England. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and boiled barley. The fire pit at the center of the dirt-floored cottage glows faintly under the iron pot suspended above it. Around you, clay pots line the edges of the room. You hear the creak of a loom in the back. This is the world of Aelfhild, a common peasant woman, and this is your entry point into the largely forgotten, yet foundational role of the medieval housewife. Peasant women as economic units. When we think of medieval women, nobility often overshadows the rest, but the vast majority of women in medieval Europe were peasants, and their days were defined not by courtly romance, but by relentless labor. While male peasants performed agricultural tasks outside plowing, animal husbandry, or fieldwork, their wives held economic power indoors, though it was rarely acknowledged in records. Aelfhild rose with the sun, not out of choice but necessity. Each morning she tended the fire, ensured the grain mash for ale was soaking, and began work on the family's one or two textiles in progress. Ale brewing, by the way, wasn't just a household luxury, it was essential. Water was often unsafe, and ale, with its low alcohol content, was a safer alternative. Aelfhild's weak ale, or small beer, was brewed not for enjoyment but survival. The household was a unit of production, not just consumption. Her work wasn't limited to child-rearing and cooking. She raised chickens, cultivated a kitchen garden, and made butter. Each of these tasks carried value in the manorial economy. Butter, in particular, was both a food and a trade good. In some regions, butter was used as rent in lieu of coin. Children, birth, and survival. Aelfhild had likely given birth to more than 5 children, of whom perhaps 2 or 3 survived infancy. Midwives existed in medieval villages, but most births were assisted by other women neighbors, elder kin, or skilled housewives. Male doctors were rarely available or allowed in these settings. Childbirth was terrifying. Without antiseptics, sanitation, or pain control, the risks of death from fever or hemorrhage were high. Still, the labor didn't stop with labor. A mother's work immediately resumed within days, often sooner if it coincided with harvest or tax season. Feeding the family, the art of subtle management. Managing the food supply required cunning and strategy. Harvests were unpredictable, and meat was rare for peasants. Aelfhild's meals centered on pottage, a thick stew of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables were in season. Meat might be added only on feast days or during times of luck or favor. Foraging was a vital supplemental activity. Nettles, mushrooms, berries, and even tree bark at times. She controlled the food stores, portioned out salted fish or beans across the week, and maintained the delicate balance of feeding a family and not running out. In the hunger gap between spring and early harvest, her decisions could mean life or starvation. The domestic tools of survival. Her toolkit was humble: a grindstone for flour, a butter churn, cooking pots made of clay or cheap iron, a spindle and distaff for spinning wool, and a few wooden utensils. Tools weren't just possessions, they were investments. A good spindle passed from mother to daughter like a family heirloom. The hearth fire was life. Without it, food wouldn't cook and warmth would vanish. Aelfhild banked the coals each night to preserve them, and in the rare cases when a fire went out, women would beg embers from neighbors. Fire thieving was a noted crime in some villages, a testament to how vital it was. Women and the feudal system. Though she may have seemed peripheral in the eyes of nobles, Aelfhild's labor directly fed the feudal system. Her spinning became yarn for the lord's estate. Her eggs might be tithed to the parish priest. She might be compelled to bake for harvest festivals or prepare meals for visiting tax collectors. Feudal obligations weren't limited to her husband. Women were legally bound to manorial duties too, gleaning, herding geese, even helping during sheep shearing. In some records, women were fined independently for failing to perform these duties. In others, they were punished for brewing ale of poor quality, a surprisingly common infraction. Social ties and reputation. The village community was tight-knit and rarely forgiving. Gossip could destroy reputations. A woman seen walking the woods alone might be labeled a witch. One who dressed above her station, a clear sign of vanity, might be fined or mocked. Yet these same communities provided a safety net. Women helped each other during childbirth, shared food during lean seasons, and warned of harsh reeves or tax collectors. The housewife was also a mediator. She taught her children proper behavior, healed minor wounds, and sometimes brokered disputes when tempers flared. She was the invisible center of the social web, a role understated in chronicles, yet essential for the community's stability. Literacy and religious duty. Though illiteracy was common, religious life gave structure to Aelfhild's days. She could not read the Psalter, but she knew the rhythm of feast days, saints' days, and the church calendar. Her knowledge of prayer was oral. Sunday attendance wasn't just spiritual, it was social, political, and obligatory. Women were often judged through a religious lens. The Virgin Mary stood as the impossible ideal, while Eve served as the warning. Church sermons reinforced a woman's duty to obey her husband, raise pious children, and refrain from idleness. Yet in private, it was often the women who kept the family's spiritual life intact, repeating prayers, teaching moral tales, and keeping votive candles burning. Sickness, aging, and the widow's place. In a society where medicine was a mixture of herbs, charms, and prayer, getting sick could be a death sentence. Women were caregivers in these situations, tending to dying relatives and sometimes acting as informal healers. If Aelfhild's husband died, she might remain on the land, especially if she was past childbearing age. Widows in many communities held surprising autonomy. Some became alewives, midwives, or caretakers for younger children. Others moved in with married sons, taking on a matriarchal role within extended households. The quiet power of the peasant wife. What emerges is a picture of a woman constantly working, calculating, creating, and adapting. She was the food provider, the nurse, the economist, the moral instructor, and sometimes the last line of defense against hunger and despair. Her power may not have been written into charters or legal documents, but it was carved into the very walls of her home. And yet her name is lost to time. No chronicler recorded her voice. No monument marks her grave. But without her, the medieval village would not have functioned. The castles and courts often relied on the quiet, steady labor of women like Aelfhild, whom no one remembers, yet everyone depended on. But how did this invisible power evolve when the village economy shifted, or when war took the men away for years at a time? You've returned to Aelfhild's village, but it is quieter now. The usual sounds of plows turning soil or men's boots marching to the fields are missing. The manor reeve has just passed by with a list of obligations, but the names of many men are absent, off to war or pressed into service for their lord's campaign. In their place, a quiet transformation is occurring. Women are not only keeping the hearth, they are holding up the economy of the entire manor. This is the story of what happens when the male labor force is removed from a village, and how women like Aelfhild filled the void with labor, leadership, and resilience. War's ripple effect on rural homes. When feudal obligations demanded that men serve in military campaigns, whether for local conflicts border skirmishes, or the distant pull of the Crusades, the immediate vacuum left in their villages was palpable. Men were not always gone for months. Some disappeared for years, or simply never returned. In many cases, their absence was not filled by new male laborers. Instead, women became temporary or even permanent heads of households. These women weren't simply waiting, they were running. Women managed planting cycles, negotiated with stewards and reeves, and ensured that children were not only fed but also trained in the family trades. Some became ad hoc landlords, redistributing labor among remaining villagers. In essence, they absorbed a dual role, continuing their own heavy domestic tasks while also overseeing field work. For someone like Aelfhild, this meant rising even earlier. It meant visiting the manor steward to account for her household's output, paying taxes, and occasionally resolving disputes over boundaries or grain tithes. Taxes, tenure, and negotiation. Under normal conditions, a husband's name would appear on tax rolls or feudal records. But with his absence, Aelfhild's name might appear often qualified as wife of or widow of, but it was her who bore responsibility for the manor's quotas. In some regions, this temporary authority solidified into legal agency. In English manorial court rolls from the 13th and 14th centuries, women appear not only as tenants but as petitioners, creditors, and even defendants in land disputes. While still constrained by gender norms, these appearances reveal a surprising degree of competence and legal awareness. The ability to negotiate rents, request extensions, or settle fines meant that women needed to understand the legal language of tenure, however informally. The church may have preached submission, but the economy preached pragmatism. What's more, the manor's own survival depended on it. Breadth of the peasant woman's economy. Aelfhild, now a temporary household head, had to manage a broader scope of production. Weaving, once just for household needs, might now be traded for metal tools or extra salt. If the household owned a loom, it became a quiet economic engine. She might rent out her labor or her tools. She might offer spinning services to other homes or participate in collective workdays to gather thatch, cut peat, or shear sheep. These tasks weren't novel, but now they required her direction, scheduling, and negotiation. She had to manage both ends of the barter chain, production and exchange. And she was doing this while managing small children, foraging, preserving food, and keeping her hearth lit. The daily load nearly doubled, yet it was often done quietly, without record or recognition. Moral scrutiny and social surveillance. But this visibility came with risk. A woman managing a household alone was vulnerable to suspicion. The village watched her for signs of immorality, a broad term that could include anything from selling bread at an inflated price to simply spending time with unmarried men. The church often reinforced these anxieties. Women were cautioned not to step beyond their natural roles, even when circumstances required it. Widows or wives of absent men who handled business assertively were frequently accused of vanity or greed. Tensions increased during times of scarcity. Accusations of hoarding, witchcraft, or knowing too much about herbal remedies could emerge from what was simply strategic survival. Still, women like Aelfhild persisted because they had no alternative, and because, beneath the judgment, the village needed them. Children as economic agents. With male heads of household gone, children, especially daughters, became crucial contributors. Girls learned to spin and tend livestock earlier. Boys might help in fields under the guidance of their mothers or older neighbors. Sometimes children were sent out as servants to wealthier households in nearby villages, with their wages returned to the family. Mothers had to decide, was it better to keep a child close for help or send them off to earn food or coin? The answer depended on the harvest, the debt, and the threat of further conscription. This decentralization of the household unit redefined family roles. It blurred lines between adult and child labor, between domestic and economic duties. Yet few stories from these children survive. Community and collective work among women. Not all burdens were carried alone. Women banded together to manage collective work. They shared tools, traded excess wool, and helped repair fences or cottages. These mutual aid networks were informal, often undocumented, but essential. Aelfhild might have joined spinning bees with other women gatherings where spinning was combined with talk, news sharing, and mutual support. In some regions, these gatherings developed rules of conduct and even proto-unions, resisting exploitation from landowners who tried to underpay for wool or textiles. This quiet solidarity often went unnoticed by the male chroniclers of the age, but it created the scaffolding of rural survival. The legal position of the woman in charge. Surprisingly, common law and local customs occasionally granted women legal autonomy during male absence. In some English towns, statutes allowed women to sue or be sued in their husband's absence. Others granted widows life tenancy rights over property, even allowing them to sell movable goods. However, these rights were precarious and varied wildly between regions. They depended on the goodwill of reeves, the stability of the manor, and the absence of greedy in-laws. Still, some women used these windows to create small legacies: a daughter's dowry, a better hearth, a stronger wall, or a rented field. These were not grand monuments, but small marks of control carved into the landscape. The toll, physical and emotional. None of this came without cost. Aelfhild's body, already weathered from childbirth, faced additional strain. Without male labor, tasks like carting dung, harvesting grain, or lifting water from wells multiplied. Back pain, joint problems, and untreated wounds worsened. Nutrition suffered during poor harvests. There was emotional toll too: uncertainty about a husband's fate, fear of illness, constant financial anxiety. The religious calendar offered some rhythm but little rest. Yet this was normal. This was the expectation. Complaints were rarely recorded, and when they were framed as moral failings, not symptoms of exhaustion. The return of the men and the displacement of power. When husbands returned, if they returned, the balance of power shifted again. Some women resumed previous roles, others resisted. There are records of legal conflicts between returning husbands and wives who had managed households effectively in their absence. Disputes arose over land leases, livestock acquisitions, or control over income streams developed by women during their solo stewardship. In rare cases, women refused to step down from economic roles, especially if the husband returned injured or unable to work. This could provoke community intervention, church condemnation, or even manorial court disputes. In essence, the brief glimpse of expanded autonomy for peasant women often snapped shut, but not without tension, and not without leaving a trace. Legacies and forgotten authority. These years of solo stewardship left long-term impacts. Younger girls, having seen their mothers manage fields and markets, sometimes adopted bolder roles in adulthood. Communities, especially those repeatedly touched by war or plague, developed informal recognition of women's capabilities. While official chronicles continued to focus on kings and clergy, the household records, manorial roles, and oral traditions hint at a deeper, richer reality. That peasant women were not simply supporters of the rural economy, they were sometimes its backbone. But what happened when catastrophe struck not through war, but through sickness, when entire populations were emptied, and women had to rebuild not just households, but entire communities? You awaken in the same village, but it's no longer the same. Where once cottages stood crowded together, some now lie abandoned. The fields are overgrown in places, with animals wandering untended. Church bells still toll, but fewer gather to hear them. It is the mid-14th century, and the Black Death has passed through. Life has not resumed as it was. This is not just a tragedy, it is a transformation. In the wake of mass mortality, women like Aelfhild found themselves in an unfamiliar new world. And though hardship endured, the death that swept across Europe left room, however unintentionally, for shifts in the roles of women, especially those who had long lived in the shadows of society's records. The plague and its toll on the village. The Black Death of 1347–1351 decimated Europe. Estimates suggest that anywhere between one-third and one-half of the population perished. Villages like Aelfhild's were not spared. In fact, rural populations were particularly vulnerable due to limited medical care, dense living conditions, and lack of mobility. Entire households disappeared. Children died beside parents. Carts carried bodies daily to mass graves. The manor reeve may have died. The priest may have followed. At times, a village's women outnumbered men simply by statistical fluke, or more chillingly, because of differential exposure. Laborers sent to towns or markets where the plague spread fastest were often men. Aelfhild, now older, may have survived not out of strength but sheer isolation. Her daughters may not have been so lucky. Economic collapse, an unexpected opportunity. For those who lived, a strange reality set in. Less competition for land, more demand for labor, and a sudden scarcity of skilled workers. Landowners, desperate to maintain productivity, began offering incentives to entice tenants to return. The rigid bonds of serfdom loosened. Wages increased. Peasants began moving physically and socially. This shift benefited many, but particularly the most adaptable. Women who had experience managing households were suddenly seen not as placeholders, but as viable stewards. Some inherited land directly due to the absence of male heirs. Others negotiated favorable terms on vacant holdings. Aelfhild may have taken over her neighbor's abandoned garden. She may have rented a second spinning wheel, employing younger women to help produce textiles for a local merchant eager to meet new demand. What once would have been impossible for a peasant housewife became attainable not easily, but realistically. Widowhood and independence. The plague turned thousands of women into widows. For some, widowhood meant freedom, albeit bought at a terrible cost. Unlike married women, widows could often act legally in their own name. They could lease land, enter contracts, and appear in court. The church respected their chastity. The manor respected their rent. Records from English manorial courts show an increase in widows acting as head tenants, not just temporary stewards. Some remarried strategically. Others never did, choosing instead to operate independently for as long as custom allowed. Older women like Aelfhild, now in her 40s or 50s, may have held unusual influence within the village. She had survived famine, war, and plague. And now she had something very rare in the medieval world: leverage. The rebuilding years, skills, tools, and memory. Rebuilding the village was not simply about labor. It required memory, knowledge of planting seasons, construction techniques, food preservation, and religious observance. And much of that memory resided in the minds of women. Aelfhild may have been called upon to teach younger girls how to weave, how to mend roofs with thatch, or how to interpret weather signs for harvest timing. With the loss of older generations, these skills became precious. Oral tradition, always important, now became a lifeline for reconstruction. Women's tools, looms, churns, pots, and blades became essential assets. They were used not only for production but for training. A surviving household became a school. A surviving woman became a teacher, whether she wished to be or not. Religion and the search for meaning. The church itself was shaken. Many priests had died, others had fled. Some were deemed cowards, others saints. The faithful struggled to make sense of the suffering. Was the plague God's punishment, a test, a sign of the end times? For women, especially widows and matriarchs, religious interpretation became more personal. Aelfhild may have maintained a home altar. She may have led prayers in the absence of a priest. The liturgical calendar resumed, but with a different feel, less performative, more intimate. Religious life also changed practically. With fewer clergy, women sometimes assumed informal leadership roles in parish life, organizing feast days, maintaining the chapel, or helping redistribute food to the orphaned and poor. The labor shortage and new gender roles. The sheer absence of labor forced reevaluation of gendered tasks. Jobs once considered men's work, such as thatching, ditch digging, or carting goods, were performed by women, and not just temporarily. Women in town guilds began to appear more frequently. While many guilds resisted admitting women, necessity bent tradition. In smaller towns and villages, craftswomen emerged as shoemakers, apothecaries, and merchants. They passed on tools and knowledge to daughters rather than sons when daughters were all that remained. Though most women still labored under restrictive laws and cultural norms, the edges of the old order frayed. A peasant woman spinning wool for personal use might begin selling her cloth. A widow with 3 fields might lease one to a young family and collect income. This was not emancipation, but it was evolution. Narratives in silence, the lack of recognition. Despite these changes, historical records remained stubbornly silent on most women's lives. Chronicles still focused on nobles, knights, and kings. Laws continued to assume male heads of household. Parish registers recorded births and deaths, but rarely the daily negotiations and survival strategies women performed. Aelfhild, if remembered at all, would be named only in tax records or court rolls. And yet, her labor, decisions, and memory shaped the reconstruction of the village. We are left with fragments: fines for sheep grazing in the wrong field, payments for ale sold during Lent, petitions for firewood rights. These fragments reveal not scandal but function. They show us lives lived quietly, steadily, and with purpose. The return of stability and the limits of change. By the late 14th century, population began to recover. With that recovery came attempts to reinstate the pre-plague social order. The ruling class issued statutes to cap wages, restrict mobility, and reassert control over land and labor. For many women, especially those who had gained property or independence, this marked a return to constraint. Widows were pressured to remarry. Female-headed households faced increased scrutiny. Legal reforms rolled back some of the freedoms born from necessity. Still, the memory of those years did not disappear, and in places where population remained low, the new social arrangements endured at least in part. Women's expanded roles had created pathways, even if narrow and contested, for future generations. Legacy of the medieval housewife. By now, Aelfhild would be an old woman, perhaps the oldest in her village. She would have lived through famine, war, plague, and political upheaval. She would have raised and buried children, managed land, brewed ale, woven wool, negotiated rents, cared for the dying, prayed, and remembered. Her world had changed, not always in ways she could control, but in ways she adapted to. Her life was never recorded in epic poems or stained glass windows, but it formed the foundation of rural life. In her quiet resilience, Aelfhild represented thousands of women across Europe, women whose stories were never told, but who held history in their hands. Final reflection: why the invisible endures. As we close the story of the medieval housewife, we are left with a paradox. The most essential figures in history, those who ensured survival, nurtured life, maintained order, are often those whose names we do not know. Aelfhild is not unique in her invisibility. She is representative, and in recognizing her, we gain access to a deeper, more honest understanding of history, not through crowns and wars, but through clay pots, spinning wheels, and kitchen gardens. So we must ask, if the most vital forces in a society are invisible to its record keepers, How many more layers of history remain unread, not lost, but simply unseen? Story 2. Managing land while men went to war. You are standing at the edge of a great stone manor, perhaps in the lush green hills of Normandy or the misty lowlands of Yorkshire. The banners of a noble house hang from the turrets, but there is no lord to receive visitors. He is far away, maybe fighting in a campaign against Scotland, or perhaps on crusade. In his absence, the household continues to function seamlessly, efficiently, and with unmistakable authority. That authority belongs to a woman. Not a queen or abbess, but a noblewoman, the lady of the manor. Her name may be Elinor, Isolde, or Alex. She is dressed not in silks but in linen and fur-lined wool, and her hands are ink-stained from the ledgers she oversees. She is no placeholder. She governs. This is the world of noblewomen in medieval Europe, not simply as wives or ornaments, but as administrators, judges, and stewards of vast estates. Marriage as power transfer. Noblewomen entered their roles through marriage, not choice. A girl of noble birth might be wed as early as 12 or 14. Her dowry, land, wealth, titles was not merely a gift. It was a calculated political tool, designed to merge estates, secure loyalty, and produce heirs. But the marriage contract was also a transaction that came with responsibility. Upon her husband's absence or death, the noblewoman did not retreat into passivity. She stepped into a role of governance that, though shaped by gendered expectations, wielded real power. And in some cases, she had prepared for it her entire life. Education and estate preparation. Unlike most women of the medieval world, noble daughters were often educated at least in matters of estate management, letter writing, and religion. A future lady might learn Latin well enough to read scriptures or correspondence. More importantly, she would learn arithmetic for accounting and the basics of legal procedure for managing disputes among tenants. This education was often guided by elder women mothers, governesses, or nuns in convents where noble daughters were sometimes sent. From them, a young woman learned how to keep a household running and eventually how to command it. By the time her husband rode off to war, she was likely already overseeing aspects of the estate, organizing supplies, managing retainers, and negotiating with reeves and stewards. Life without the Lord. When the Lord was absent, whether for war, pilgrimage, or courtly duty, it fell to the lady to govern. Her duties were extensive. Administrative oversight. She managed ledgers, recorded rents, and ensured the household operated within its means. She approved harvest storage, monitored supply levels, and accounted for expenses. Judicial authority. On many manors, the lady presided over minor legal matters, disputes between tenants, fines for broken contracts, and enforcement of feudal obligations. She did not rule from instinct alone, but based decisions on customary law and manor codes. Military logistics. While she might not fight, she ensured that the household could support war. She gathered levies, arranged for provisions, and oversaw blacksmiths and armorers. Spiritual patronage. As the symbolic moral heart of the estate, she maintained the manor chapel, funded clerics, and hosted feast days. Her piety was expected and often strategic. This was not merely holding the fort. This was real governance, and though she might sign documents on behalf of her husband, the decisions were hers. Servants, stewards, and surveillance. A noblewoman never worked alone. An entire hierarchy of servants, clerks, and stewards stood between her and the tenants, yet she had to manage them. She reviewed the stewards' records, questioned the bailiff's grain counts, and ensured the reeve delivered rents. If a cellarer failed to stock enough wine or a cook misused kitchen stores, it was the lady who bore the shame and the consequences. Household management was also about control. Noble households were centers of political activity. Letters had to be vetted, guests monitored, servants disciplined. Surveillance was constant, and loyalty could not be assumed. A successful lady had to be diplomatic, vigilant, and decisive. Hospitality and performance. The noble estate was not only a home but a stage. A lady's public persona, gracious, pious, and generous, was part of the estate's reputation. Hosting visiting clergy, neighboring lords, or royal messengers was a test of wealth and dignity. The feast had to impress. The linen had to gleam. The protocol had to be followed. But beneath the surface, this was more than pageantry. It was politics. A well-received guest might support the estate in court. A poorly fed nobleman might turn hostile. Every course served, every guest seated, was a message, and it was the lady who composed it. Correspondence in the wider world. Though she remained physically within the estate, the noblewoman corresponded far beyond it. Letters were her lifeline to her husband at war, her sons at court, her brothers in other territories. These letters often included estate news, requests for resources, or political updates. Some women even acted as intermediaries in feuds or alliances, using their unique position as non-combatants to influence outcomes indirectly. Surviving letters from noblewomen like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Christine de Pizan show not only literary skill but sharp political reasoning. In these quiet exchanges of ink and wax, a parallel power structure operated, one shaped by influence rather than arms. Motherhood and dynastic responsibility. Her most celebrated duty, of course, was to produce heirs. A noblewoman who bore multiple sons might be praised and protected. One who did not might find her position vulnerable. But once children were born, her role did not end. She oversaw their early education, chose their tutors, arranged their marriages, and negotiated their dowries. She taught daughters to manage households and prepared sons for knighthood or clerical life. Sometimes she acted as regent for an underage heir, a role requiring political cunning and legal knowledge. The successful regent preserved a dynasty. The failed one risked its ruin. This was not maternal indulgence. It was political engineering. Religion and authority. The church upheld the ideal of the obedient, pious wife, but noblewomen had long exploited that ideal to reinforce their influence. By funding monasteries, founding nunneries, or donating relics, a lady gained spiritual credit and social prestige. She might install a relative as abbot or ensure a daughter entered a prestigious convent. Some noblewomen chose a religious life themselves, either after widowhood or through family arrangements. These women, especially as abbesses, wielded land, income, and ecclesiastical authority rivaling many secular lords. In these roles, their power was sanctified yet very real. Risk, rebellion, and resistance. Not all noblewomen acted in the shadows. Some defied expectation outright. Matilda of Tuscany ruled territories and led troops during the investiture controversy. Isabella of France, queen to Edward II, organized an invasion of England and toppled her husband's regime. Eleanor of Aquitaine accompanied crusades and commanded political life in two kingdoms. Even lesser-known ladies occasionally led defenses of castles during sieges or organized tenant resistance against exploitative stewards. Though rare, these stories reveal what lay beneath the surface. That noblewomen, when called upon or cornered, could act as sovereigns in everything but name. But when the Lord returned, the power of the noblewoman was often provisional. When the husband returned, especially victorious, authority reverted quickly. Documents were signed again in his name. The household shifted back to patriarchal lines. Still, the memory of her governance remained, and in some families it was passed on as example. In the ladies' solar, the private chambers where women of the household spun wool, wrote letters, or played music, these stories were whispered. They were not in the official histories, but they were in the memory of the manor. And so we are left to wonder, How did these hidden legacies shape the women who followed? Did their daughters quietly inherit the will to govern? The year is now 1268. The hall remains quiet but not idle. The noblewoman you met, perhaps Alina, perhaps Alex, has not only kept her estate running during her husband's long campaign, she has expanded it. The fields are well tilled. The harvests have been ample. The steward reports favorable rents. Tenants are loyal. Yet new pressures are building. Rising taxes for the war effort, a border dispute with a neighboring manor, whispers of rebellion among villeins, and rumors of disease inland. This is no longer just household management. It is political navigation, economic acumen, social strategy, and beneath it all, a careful balancing act between loyalty, survival, and legacy. Let us walk again through her world, one of quiet authority, contested space, and enduring memory. Economic governance in a time of uncertainty. The lady of the manor has never held a coin without considering its weight. But now, every penny matters more than ever. With war draining local resources, the crown may call for additional levies. The church, too, increases its tithe requests. While the estate remains productive, inflation has crept in. Imported goods cost more, wages inch upward, and the risk of tenant flight looms large. To maintain solvency, the lady must adjust rents without losing tenant loyalty, sell surplus grain or wool at opportune times, invest in durable tools for laborers, negotiate new grazing rights or timber usage. In some manors, noblewomen negotiated contracts with merchants directly, especially when selling wool, England's most valuable medieval export. The best stewards knew to leave the final price approval to the lady herself. Not every decision is glamorous. Sometimes it's deciding whether to slaughter an aging ox or keep it one more season, or whether to accept partial rent payment in chickens, barrels of ale, or days of labor. Boring, yes, but civilization is built on this kind of boredom. The politics of land and inheritance. With so many noblemen dying in war or pilgrimage, land transfers become more complex. The lady must defend her children's claims. A cousin might demand a disputed field. A neighboring manor may assert overlapping grazing rights. A bastard son might challenge inheritance altogether. In this world, documents are everything. The lady guards the charters and deeds of her estate like holy relics. She can recite the wording of her marriage agreement and her dowry grant. She may even ride to the nearest abbey or shire court to defend her rights in person, or send a trusted retainer with a letter bearing her seal. Feudal law allows some flexibility for widows and heiresses, but every claim is a contest. A woman who cannot defend her land may lose it not just for herself, but for her children. And so her role becomes not just maternal, but dynastic. The court within the manor. Every manor was a miniature kingdom, and every noblewoman its queen in practice, if not in name. Once or twice a year, or as needed, she presides over manor court. Here, tenants gather to settle disputes, pay fines, and receive orders. A tenant who failed to repair his roof may be fined. A pig wandering into another man's barley field may provoke a public argument. A daughter's secret marriage might require intervention. The lady listens to testimony, consults her reeve or steward, and makes decisions rooted in local custom. In the margins of these courts, other matters are whispered. A peasant woman seeks mercy for an overdue rent. A boy offers to work the fields in exchange for firewood rights. A tenant widow petitions to remain on her husband's plot. Here we see the soft side of power. The lady's decisions could ruin or rescue a family. Compassion and pragmatism are weighed carefully. What benefits the estate must also maintain peace. Crisis management, from famine to fire. Even the best managed estates face disaster. One failed harvest can unravel decades of stewardship. In famine years, the lady must stretch stores, ration grain, and decide who eats and who doesn't. Sometimes she barters with neighboring manors. Other times she appeals to the local priory for alms or provides them herself, securing both reputation and salvation. Fire is another constant threat. A kitchen blaze can destroy a hall in minutes. Disease, too, spreads quickly. A single fever can infect the servants' quarters and beyond. In these moments, the lady leads not with sword but with presence. She coordinates care, oversees rebuilding, buries the dead. She may call for processions or penance. She fasts in solidarity with her tenants. These rituals are not merely symbolic, they are stabilizers. Alliances through marriage and patronage. Marriage is not just a personal affair. It's a geopolitical move. The lady may arrange matches for her daughters that secure military allies, trade routes, or land claims. Dowries are negotiated like treaties. She might travel to oversee negotiations, or send detailed letters outlining expectations: cattle, cloth, silver, or land. Religious patronage also builds alliances. Funding a chapel wing earns spiritual merit, yes, but also goodwill from abbots, clerics, and even bishops. A lady who gives generously may ensure her family's place in monastic prayers for generations. She understands, legacy is as much about memory as bloodline. Social control and gender expectations. Her power is undeniable, but so are its limits. She is still expected to remain modest, pious, and obedient even when she's effectively ruling. Her letters often begin with self-effacing phrases: "Your humble servant," "a weak woman who begs your wisdom." These are rhetorical cloaks for steely decision-making. If she asserts too much authority, rumors may circulate. If she fraternizes too closely with a steward or priest, scandal follows. Even successful governance can be punished by envy or misogyny. And yet she walks this line with precision. The return of the Lord, a shifting balance. After years abroad, the Lord may return injured, weary, politically changed. His expectations might not match the reality at home. He may resent changes she's made: higher rents, new tenants, unfamiliar alliances. Or he may praise her management, recognizing that the estate flourished in his absence. Sometimes conflict emerges. A husband may reclaim control abruptly, dismissing stewards she trusted or undoing marriages she arranged. Other times he defers to her judgment, especially if her decisions led to prosperity. In rare cases, he steps back altogether, preferring to hunt or politic, while she runs the estate with quiet authority. But even in the best scenario, the transition is uneasy. Power shared in absence rarely divides neatly upon return. Inheritance and the long view. The noblewoman's final power lies in shaping her legacy. A widow may choose which son inherits what land. She may oversee the founding of a family chantry, ensuring perpetual prayers. She may endow a hospital or convent, securing her name in stone and song. Sometimes her memory survives in the margins of chronicles. Lady Maud held this manor during the war years and built the Southern Chapel. Or, the Lady of the Hall granted new leases after the fire of 1293. Other times, it's only her seal on a parchment in an archive. Yet without her decisions, wealth would not have endured, dynasties would have faltered, and estates would have failed. Toward a conclusion, quiet power. By the end of her life, the noblewoman may have never left her region. She might not have ridden to battle or debated in court, but she will have held the reins of power behind curtains, through parchment, over firelit ledgers. She will have settled disputes among men, ensured children were fed and titled, defended land and rights through logic and law, maintained peace through diplomacy and presence. Her legacy may be subtle but enduring. But what happened to the noblewoman when peace was shattered not by swords but by plague? When servants, tenants, and children alike fell to the Black Death? What role did she play when death came not for one, but for half? The air is still, unnaturally still. The manor once filled with bustle and routine now echoes with absence. The kitchen hearth is cold. The grain stores are sealed. The chapel bell tolls, but no one comes. It is 1349, and the Black Death has arrived at the noble estate. The lady of the manor, once a figure of order and governance, now becomes something else entirely. The last authority, the last hope, and in many cases, the final witness to a world unraveling. What does it mean to lead when the structures you preserved begin to rot from the inside out? When every knock at the door may bring news of another death? Let us return one final time to the noblewoman's world, not to see it thrive, but to see how it endured the greatest demographic catastrophe Europe had ever known. When the plague came to the manor, the Black Death, which struck Europe from 1347 to 1351, devastated noble and peasant alike. Carried by fleas and rats, but worsened by poverty, malnutrition, and mobility, it moved faster than messages and killed faster than prayer. When it reached noble estates, it did not discriminate. The lady's household was just as vulnerable. Servants died in their sleep. Priests died giving last rites. Children sickened before their mothers' eyes. In some places, even burial ceased. There were simply too many dead. For a noblewoman, the plague brought three simultaneous roles: mourner, caretaker, and administrator of death. Governing in isolation. As retainers fled and stewards died, the noblewoman was often the last functioning authority. In some records, we see her doing the following: sealing the estate, locking gates, canceling market visits, denying entry to travelers, quarantining the sick, converting barns or halls into isolation spaces, recording deaths, maintaining some semblance of order through ledger entries, burial lists, and estate updates for absentee lords. She had to decide who was buried in the chapel graveyard and who in a mass pit. She decided how to distribute dwindling stores. She issued orders to burn bedding and clothes. She signed orders alone. And she did this while grieving her own children, her nurses, her priest, her world. Piety, guilt, and the church's collapse. The Black Death shattered religious certainty. Clergy died in droves. Monasteries emptied. Processions ceased. Pilgrimages halted. For noblewomen, who were often the spiritual heart of the manor, this was particularly crushing. The rhythm of feast days, the rituals of penance and prayer all collapsed. The spiritual duties that had given her life meaning now seemed distant, irrelevant, or simply unavailable. Some noblewomen turned inward. They adopted extreme acts of piety: fasting, flagellation, constant prayer. Others turned to private chapels, sponsoring masses even when no clergy remained. A few chroniclers note women preaching in private, performing burial rites, or leading collective prayers. Faith did not vanish, but it changed. It became personal, desperate, and shaped by survival. Widowhood, inheritance, and the power vacuum. In many cases, the noblewoman became a widow, sometimes overnight. If she survived and her husband and sons did not, she might inherit control of vast tracts of land. Medieval law, especially in England and parts of France, allowed widows to retain dower rights, often 1/3 of her husband's estate. But with so many deaths, some women became full heiresses by default. This could be a temporary window of authority. Many remarried quickly, sometimes under pressure from the crown or church, eager to consolidate land. Others refused, choosing instead to govern independently. A few entered religious life, not as an escape, but as a strategic move, becoming abbesses with control over land and income. Even in grief, a noblewoman was expected to think dynastically. Estate recovery and labor crisis. After the worst wave passed, the estate was broken. Fields lay fallow, orchards overgrew, sheep wandered untended, mills stood silent. The greatest challenge was labor. With up to 50% of the peasant population dead, the workforce collapsed. Surviving tenants demanded higher wages. Villeins refused feudal duties. Lawsuits multiplied as heirs argued over vacant holdings. The noblewoman had to rebuild not in celebration, but necessity. Some strategies she employed. Offering wages. For the first time, manorial labor was hired at competitive rates. Leasing land. Abandoned plots were leased to smaller tenants, often women or former servants. Adjusting expectations. Lords and ladies could no longer expect full service. Flexibility became key to survival. This was not a world of noble grandeur, but of negotiation and compromise. A noblewoman who understood this thrived. One who didn't saw her estate fall into ruin. New relationships with peasantry. The shared trauma of plague created new, if fragile, relationships. The lady who buried her own children beside those of her tenants was changed. Those who remained saw her not just as a remote authority, but as a survivor. Some records suggest increased generosity in manor courts. Others show women granting longer leases, forgiving debts, or giving dowries to orphaned girls. This did not erase hierarchy, but it reshaped it. In some places, women and men who had never held land now did. Former servants became tenants. Daughters, once ignored in inheritance, now became crucial. The noblewoman now governed not just through lineage, but through resilience. Memory and monument. In the years after the plague, many noblewomen commissioned chapels, tombs, or stained glass in memory of those lost. These were acts of mourning, but also of narrative. They told the world, we survived, we remembered, we endured. Some left behind illuminated books of hours, filled with prayers and annotations. Others made charitable gifts, food for the poor, blankets, donations to hospitals. In these actions, they shaped how they and their estates would be remembered. The quiet transformation. The plague marked a before and after, and while not all changes endured, many did. More women as property holders. Wider roles in estate governance. Greater flexibility in feudal relationships. A deeper intertwining of household survival and female leadership. The noblewoman, once expected only to marry and bear children, had now proven herself capable of guiding an estate through the darkest of times. And yet her story remained largely unrecorded unless we look closely. Final reflection, legacy in absence. So we ask, why are these women absent from most histories? Because their power was exercised in daily decisions, not royal edicts. Because their leadership looked like cooking rations, writing letters, settling disputes, not leading armies. Because they worked in stone halls and solar chambers, not on battlefields. Yet their fingerprints are everywhere in surviving manors, in family names, in land deeds, in stained glass. The noblewoman was not a footnote in medieval history. She was its spine. And if we listen carefully to the silences between the chronicles, we might just hear her footsteps, soft, deliberate, enduring. Story 3. Women of the Cloistered World. You walk through a narrow passage, hemmed in by high stone walls softened by creeping ivy. Beyond the archway lies a world almost entirely female. The courtyard is quiet. A few women move slowly in the gardens, their heads covered in white wimples and black veils. Bells chime softly, calling the sisters to prayer. This is not a place of ornament or passivity. This is a medieval convent, and at its head stands an abbess. She is not merely a spiritual leader, but a landowner, judge, teacher, and sometimes even a political advisor. In a world that denied women most forms of formal power, the cloister became a paradox, a space of restriction that allowed for unexpected authority. Let us enter quietly into the life of these cloistered women and discover how the abbess wielded power through silence, structure, and sacredness. Why women chose the cloister. In the medieval world, not all women became wives or mothers. For some especially noble daughters and wealthy merchant kin, the convent offered an alternative. Some were sent as children, often as part of a family's religious offering or political strategy. Others entered willingly, seeking a life of spiritual devotion, learning, or relative autonomy. For women without dowries, the convent could also provide food, shelter, and protection. The cloister was not just a refuge, it was a career path. And at the summit of that path stood the abbess. Daily life in the convent. Convent life was governed by the rule, most commonly the rule of Saint Benedict. This meant structured days filled with prayer, the divine office, manual labor, study, and communal living. The day was divided by bells. Matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, terce sext and none throughout the day, vespers in the evening, compline at night. Between these hours of prayer, nuns tended gardens, copied manuscripts, wove cloth, and sometimes taught girls from noble families. Silence was often practiced, especially during meals or reflection. Speech, when allowed, was careful, measured, and purposeful. Far from idle, these women maintained a self-sufficient community that required governance, accounting, diplomacy, and spiritual leadership. The abbess as administrator. The abbess, elected by her community and often confirmed by a bishop or even the pope, was more than a symbolic figurehead. She oversaw land and property. Many convents held estates, mills, fisheries, and rental properties. The abbess managed these through stewards or directly. She collected rents, negotiated leases, and ensured legal documentation was maintained. Legal authority. In some regions, abbesses had judicial rights over their lands, settling tenant disputes, enforcing fines, and defending property rights in court. Internal discipline. The abbess enforced the rule. She assigned duties, corrected behavior, and guided novices. She also supervised confessions and penances. Relations with the outside world. She communicated with bishops, secular lords, donors, and other religious houses. Letters bearing her seal carried weight. This was no ceremonial post. It was a role of daily responsibility, one that required literacy, tact, resilience, and vision. Education and intellectual life. Convents were centers of learning. Many nuns were literate, and some became scribes, teachers, or even authors. The abbess ensured access to books, religious texts, of course, but also classical works, saints, lives, and commentaries. Some convents had libraries rivaling those of male monasteries. Nuns copied manuscripts by hand, illuminating pages with intricate illustrations. They wrote letters, kept annals, and composed prayers. Some, like the famed Hildegard of Bingen, wrote treatises on medicine, science, theology, and music. Abbesses encouraged intellectual inquiry within the bounds of faith. For noble girls educated in these convents, the abbess was not just a spiritual guide, but a role model of female leadership and erudition. The spiritual authority of the abbess. The abbess was a mother figure both in title and role. She guided the spiritual development of her nuns, delivered teachings during chapter meetings, and modeled virtue. She was responsible for the moral health of the convent. She organized fasts, feast day celebrations, and pilgrimages. She supervised the production of devotional objects and commissioned artwork for the chapel. In some regions, abbesses blessed new novices and led certain liturgical ceremonies. While she did not celebrate Mass, that role belonged to ordained priests. She orchestrated the rhythm of worship. Her voice echoed in the chants of the choir, in the quiet counsel to a troubled nun, and in the solemn reading of the rule. Relations with the outside world. Despite the walls, convents were not cut off from the world. Donors and patrons visited or corresponded regularly. Families of nuns sent gifts, messages, or requests for prayers. Local tenants and laborers came to pay rent or settle disputes. Bishops and papal envoys conducted inspections or issued decrees. The abbess navigated all of these interactions with care. She protected the autonomy of her house while respecting ecclesiastical and feudal hierarchies. She hosted visitors with appropriate hospitality and handled sensitive political communications. In some places, her reputation extended beyond the cloister. A respected abbess might be consulted by bishops or nobles on moral or legal matters. Internal conflict and discipline. Convents were not immune to conflict. Disputes over chores, rivalries between nuns, disagreements about discipline, these all fell to the abbess to manage. In serious cases, she might call for a formal confession before the chapter or impose penance. Occasionally, factions formed, especially in larger or wealthier houses. Power struggles between senior nuns or divisions over theological matters could threaten unity. The abbess had to mediate with firmness and compassion. She also faced external interference. A bishop might attempt to impose his own candidate for abbess. A local lord might demand concessions or favors. In these moments, the abbess defended the rule and her authority. Challenges unique to women's religious houses. While male monasteries often enjoyed greater prestige, women's convents faced more scrutiny and limitation. Funding, convents received fewer endowments and were often seen as less important. Clerical oversight. Male bishops could overrule abbess decisions or interfere in elections. Mobility. Nuns were confined to the cloister, limiting external advocacy or education. Yet abbesses navigated these limits with ingenuity. They forged alliances, managed scarce resources wisely, and leaned on community reputation to protect their autonomy. In doing so, they created lasting institutions. Toward the end of a life in service. An abbess often served for life. In old age, she might step back from daily tasks but retain advisory power. Upon her death, the convent mourned deeply and began the process of electing a successor. Some were buried in special tombs within the chapel. Others requested simple graves. A few left behind spiritual writings, letters, or administrative records that still survive. Even in death, her decisions shaped the lives of dozens of women and the legacy of the convent itself. Unanswered thought, sacred space or silent prison. As we leave the quiet corridors of the cloister, we are left with a question that haunted many women, especially those who did not choose this life freely. Was the convent a sanctuary of education, leadership, and sacred meaning? Or was it a silent prison, an institution that channeled female power, only so long as it stayed walled in? The abbess may have held keys to both answers. The convent remains quiet as always, but beneath its silence runs the steady hum of power. The abbess, still cloaked in humility, now writes letters to bishops, negotiates land disputes with stewards, and prepares for a royal visit. The outside world, once seen as the place of action, now comes to her. This is not simply a place of prayer, it is a microcosm of medieval politics, and the abbess is its center. In this section, we explore how cloistered women, especially abbesses, wielded worldly influence in distinctly spiritual ways through land management, letter writing, diplomacy, and legacy building. These acts may have been cloaked in silence, but they shaped the course of local and sometimes national history. Land, the economic foundation of spiritual power. Medieval convents were not self-sufficient in name, only they required vast tracts of land to support their communities. Agriculture provided food, income, and barter goods. The abbess, as the manager of this system, operated much like a secular lord. Convents owned arable fields, tended by tenant farmers or laborers who paid rent in grain or coin. Pastures and woods, used for sheep grazing, timber harvesting, or hunting rights. Mills and fisheries, often leased for steady revenue. Urban property, rented houses or shops in nearby towns. The abbess managed all of this through estate managers, but key decisions, leases, disputes, new acquisitions rested with her. She reviewed harvest reports. She approved contracts. She inspected properties during allowed travels. In some cases, she even led legal defenses of convent lands in royal courts. Far from symbolic, her stewardship determined the convent's survival and prosperity. Rent rolls, account books, and audits. Within the convent scriptorium sat ledgers thicker than any psalter. These rent rolls recorded tenant names, land boundaries, due dates, and arrears. The abbess, literate and trained, read them carefully. Each year she reviewed accounts from bailiffs and reeves, repairs to tenements and chapels, harvest yields in grain stores, tenant absences or deaths affecting rent collection. Failure to manage these records could lead to insolvency. Some abbesses improved convent finances dramatically, increasing agricultural output or resolving long-standing disputes. These boring numbers, so often overlooked in chronicles, reveal just how dependent the spiritual world was on the material one. Conflict in court, when the convent was challenged. Despite vows of peace, conflict was inevitable. Abbesses faced challenges from local lords seeking to reclaim donated lands, bishops demanding jurisdiction over convent governance, townspeople disputing property boundaries, tenants refusing service or rent. The abbess, far from helpless, responded with legal precision. She consulted lawyers, many trained in ecclesiastical or Roman law. She wrote petitions to bishops, appeals to the king, or pleas to the pope. In some cases, abbesses won court cases defending convent autonomy. One famous case from 13th century France shows an abbess successfully arguing her right to appoint her own confessor, resisting episcopal interference. These victories were not always publicized, but they ensured that the walls of the convent remained as much legal fortresses as spiritual ones. The letter as a weapon of influence. The abbess's most powerful tool was not the sword or staff but the pen. Letters were central to medieval diplomacy, and abbesses mastered their use. In elegant Latin or vernacular script, they wrote to bishops requesting sacraments or permissions, landlords negotiating rents or rights, other abbesses forming alliances or sharing advice, kings and queens thanking them for patronage or asking protection. These letters followed strict formalities, but within their structure lay nuance. An abbess might flatter, urge, subtly threaten, or recall a past favor. Letters also served to network. Convents built connections with one another, sharing devotional practices, spiritual guidance, and news. Some abbesses corresponded across countries, especially in major religious orders like the Cistercians or Benedictines. These epistolary webs reveal an invisible map of female influence spanning Christendom. Cultural and artistic patronage. With income came the ability to commission art, and abbesses did so with intention. They oversaw the creation of illuminated manuscripts, gospels, psalters, and books of hours copied and painted by nuns. Some included personalized prayers or family crests, altarpieces and stained glass, depicting saints, biblical scenes, or abbesses themselves in donor portraits. Architecture, expansions to chapels, new cloister walks, or infirmaries. Each act of patronage served multiple purposes. Devotional, enhancing worship. Didactic, educating nuns and guests. Memorial, securing the abbess's legacy. These projects created a visible expression of the abbess's leadership, visible long after her death. Spiritual intercession for the powerful. Nuns were often seen as brides of Christ, their prayers holding special merit. As such, abbesses received requests for intercessory prayer for the souls of nobles, bishops, or merchants. prayers for safe childbirth, masses for the dead. In return, patrons sent gifts, land, relics, books, or funds. This exchange turned the convent into a spiritual service provider, one that brought in both material support and political goodwill. An abbess who cultivated these relationships wisely ensured the convent's protection and prominence, education, and the training of future generations. Many convents house not only nuns, but boarders young girls of noble birth placed there to learn reading, religion, etiquette, and sometimes writing. The abbess served as head mistress in practice, if not title. She oversaw their instruction, ensured their piety, and often arranged their dowries or entry into religious life. In doing so, she shaped future mothers, noblewomen, and sometimes future nuns. This role, rarely mentioned in public records, quietly embedded convent values into elite medieval society. Abbess as model and myth. Some abbesses became semi-legendary in their lifetimes. They were admired not just for piety, but for leadership, wisdom, and even charisma. Hildegard of Bingen was sought out by emperors and popes. Gertrude of Nivelles was venerated as a saint and protector of travelers. Eadburh of Winchester advised kings in Anglo-Saxon England. But most abbesses remained local legends remembered in stained glass, marginal notes, or the oral traditions of their convent. Their influence did not end at death. Many were buried under the chapel floor. Others had annual masses said in their name. Some were quietly canonized in local devotion, even if never formally recognized by Rome. But what happens when the convent itself is threatened? While abbesses managed their estates skillfully for centuries, what happened when larger forces, war, plague, or political reform, threatened the very existence of monastic life? When soldiers looted cloisters, kings reformed the church, and entire convents were dissolved, how did the abbess respond? Could silence withstand steel and statute? That story, too, must be told. The convent is no longer still. The peace that once defined its walled gardens has been disrupted by the far-off echo of hooves, the arrival of royal messengers, and the shifting tides of a changing world. It is the late 14th or early 15th century. Across Europe, war looms, reforms are whispered in sermons, and plague has shaken faith to its core. The abbess stands not just as a spiritual leader now, but as a figure resisting the collapse of a centuries-old way of life. This final chapter is not only about perseverance but about adaptation and, in some cases, letting go. What does it mean to hold power when your very institution is being questioned? When your walls, once sanctified, become targets for kings, peasants, or reformers? When your vows must answer to new rulers, and your quiet life becomes the subject of loud public debate? Let us walk with the abbess through the final and most trying stage of her leadership. The impact of war and pillage. Throughout the 100 Years' War, 1337–1453, convents in England and France suffered significant disruption. While their spiritual mission continued, many became sites of conflict. Looting and occupation. Monasteries and nunneries were raided by both foreign armies and local militias. The wealth they quietly accumulated, books, relics, grain stores, silverware, became tempting targets. Billeting of soldiers. Some abbesses were forced to host troops, their chapels turned into barracks, their refectories stripped for firewood. Disruption of rents. War interrupted tenant payments and trade routes. Estates fell into arrears or were destroyed outright. The abbess now faced decisions that had once been unthinkable: hiding relics, sending nuns away for safety, negotiating with local lords for protection, sometimes at a cost. This was leadership not from behind stone altars, but amid fire and fear. Plague revisited, the loss of sisters and structure. Though the Black Death's first wave passed in the mid-14th century, subsequent outbreaks returned again and again. Convents were not spared. Entire generations of nuns died within weeks. In some houses, the number of sisters dropped so low that the community could no longer meet the requirements to elect a new abbess. Recruitment slowed. Education programs halted. Records from English and German convents reveal urgent appeals to bishops for permission to accept younger, less trained women, or to merge with other declining houses. An abbess who survived multiple outbreaks bore the additional burden of rebuilding her community from near extinction. In some cases, she sent letters requesting new novices. In others, she begged for financial aid from secular or ecclesiastical patrons. Yet the social respect for nuns declined in tandem with the church's own credibility. The cracks in the cloister, growing calls for reform. By the 15th century, murmurs of corruption, idleness, and irrelevance surrounded monastic institutions. Many criticisms, especially of male monasteries, accused monks of luxury and laziness. But nuns, too, came under scrutiny. Abbesses faced accusations of lax discipline, allowing talking during silence hours, leniency in rule observance, nepotism, admitting relatives without proper vocation, worldliness, managing too much land or meddling in secular affairs. Though often exaggerated, these criticisms gained momentum in the lead-up to the Protestant Reformation. Some abbesses embraced internal reform, tightening discipline, recommitting to the rule, simplifying liturgical life. Others resisted, viewing these changes as threats to autonomy. Still, the image of the abbess, once revered as a mother and steward, became complicated. No longer above reproach, she now had to defend her authority in a changing religious and political landscape. Encroaching state power and monastic reorganization. In England, the crown had long viewed monastic wealth with interest. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, that interest turned to action. Under Henry VIII, the dissolution of the monasteries, 1536-1541, would lead to the forced closure of hundreds of religious houses, including convents. Even before this, abbesses were pressured to submit inventories of their assets, justify their community's purpose, accept royal visitors who inspected for compliance. In some regions of France and Germany, similar reforms were imposed by bishops or local princes seizing lands, merging communities, or reducing their privileges. An abbess in this era had to be not only holy, but politically astute. Her signature might be required on surrender documents. She might negotiate pensions for her sisters or plead to retain a chapel. In rare cases, she resisted. A few abbesses openly refused to surrender their houses. Others tried to hide sacred items or burn account books. Most, however, accepted the inevitable. The psychological and spiritual toll. What does it mean to spend a lifetime building a sacred community, only to watch it unravel by royal decree? For older abbesses, the final years were marked by grief and powerlessness. The convent had been not just a workplace, but a home, a sanctuary, a spiritual identity. Some found solace in retreating further into prayer. Others entered other religious institutions if allowed. A few married or returned to noble families, though such transitions were rare and deeply unsettling. The silence of the cloister, once a sign of spiritual discipline, became literal. After dissolution, many convents stood empty, their halls echoing with wind and memory. Those who survived the Reformation. In parts of Europe, especially Catholic regions like Spain, Italy, and southern Germany, convents remained active. Post-Reformation abbesses continued to govern, but with new constraints. Increased male oversight. Bishops and male clergy asserted tighter control. More enclosed lives. Strict rules on contact with the outside world. Focus on education. Many turned their efforts toward girls' schooling, forming the foundation of modern female education. In these settings, the abbess remained relevant, though her power was now more spiritual and pedagogical than administrative or legal. Legacy and what remains. What do we remember of these women? For most, only fragments survive. A name in a land dispute, a seal on a parchment, a marginal note in a manuscript, a grave beneath a crumbled chapel floor. Yet their impact lingers. Convents laid the foundation for female education systems, women's involvement in healthcare and charity, spaces for intellectual development outside of marriage. Even today, the model of a woman quietly leading a complex institution can trace its lineage back to these abbesses. They ruled not with force, but with ritual, literacy, compassion, and structure. And though many were silenced, their model of leadership endures in forms both sacred and secular. Final reflection: was it the end or a transformation? As the doors of one convent closed forever, an abbess might have asked herself, was our silence a source of strength, or the reason no one heard us fall? Were we buried or planted, to grow again in another form? In the stillness of those final moments, history did not forget the abbess, it simply turned the page. Story 4. The Midwife's Healing Birth and the Church. It is just before dawn in a cramped, smoky cottage. A woman lies on a straw-filled pallet, her hands gripping the edge of a wooden bench. Her breath is shallow, her moans rhythmic. Around her, neighbors murmur encouragement. But one figure stands slightly apart, focused, composed, experienced. She moves between the fire and the bed, clutching a leather pouch filled with herbs and cloth. She is the midwife. Before hospitals, before sterilization, and long before male physicians were allowed near a birthing bed, women like her ushered in new life. They worked in shadowed corners of history, recording no treatises, founding no schools, yet touching every generation. The medieval midwife stood at the most critical thresholds of existence: birth and death, hope and risk, miracle and misfortune. She was both needed and feared, respected and scrutinized, trusted and accused. Let us begin at her side. Who was the medieval midwife? Contrary to later perceptions, midwives were not always elderly or poor. In many villages and towns, the midwife was a respected member of the community. She might be a woman past childbearing age, who had borne many children of her own. A widow with anatomical and herbal knowledge passed down orally. A literate urban professional, especially in Southern Europe, who had trained under another midwife. What united them was experience. Formal training was rare, though not unheard of, but hands-on knowledge was essential. It was an empirical science born from observation, memory, and repetition. Midwives were called at any hour. They traveled in storms. They carried bundles of linen, swaddling cloths, herbal salves, blunt blades, and holy metals. Their presence was as crucial as the fire in the hearth. The midwife's role at birth. When labor began, the midwife was summoned quickly. Her tasks were practical, physical, emotional, and spiritual. During labor, she ensured warmth in the birthing space, massaged the mother's belly with warm oil or wine, encouraged movement, positioning, and breath, monitored pain, bleeding, and signs of danger. She also prepared birth charms, whispered prayers, and held religious tokens. Faith and function mixed freely. A midwife might invoke the Virgin Mary while using a herbal decoction to ease pain. When the child emerged, she cut the cord, rubbed the body with salt or oil, and assessed the newborn's cries, color, and breathing. Emergency rituals, baptism by necessity. One of the midwife's most critical duties was emergency baptism. If a child was born weak, unmoving, or seemingly stillborn, the midwife, acting quickly and alone, might perform a conditional baptism. This involved sprinkling water while speaking the Trinitarian formula: I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This act ensured the child's soul would be saved, even if it died moments later. Church doctrine permitted this emergency sacrament, but also imposed strict conditions. Midwives were often tested or questioned about the correct words, signs, and intentions. Mistakes could lead to accusations of spiritual endangerment or worse. Training and transmission of knowledge. Most midwives learned through apprenticeship. An older midwife would train a younger woman, sometimes a daughter or niece, through observation and shared practice. Knowledge was practical. How to reposition a breech baby. How to stop postpartum bleeding using nettles or vinegar. How to identify signs of infection. How to comfort a grieving mother after a stillbirth. This was embodied knowledge, passed not through books but through hands and eyes. In Mediterranean cities, some midwives received licenses. Town councils, especially in Italy and Spain, sometimes appointed official midwives for urban districts, especially among wealthier clients. In Northern Europe, however, the profession remained informal and local until the church grew more involved. Midwives and the church, a tense partnership. The church understood midwives were necessary, but never stopped watching them. The main concerns were sacramental accuracy. Could midwives baptize correctly and devoutly? Moral behavior. Were they chaste, sober, and pious? Spiritual orthodoxy. Were their rituals free from superstition? As early as the 13th century, church authorities began requiring oaths from midwives. These sworn declarations, made before a priest or bishop, promised to report births accurately, not to use charms or spells, to reject heretical ideas like reincarnation or astrology, to ensure Christian burial for any child that died. Failure to uphold these oaths could lead to public penance, removal from duty, or in extreme cases, accusation of witchcraft. Survival strategies, navigating between church and community. To remain in good standing, the midwife had to walk a careful line. She needed the community's trust, which came from successful births, discretion, and compassion. But she also needed the church's approval, which meant avoiding anything too pagan, mystical, or unorthodox. This balance was particularly delicate when things went wrong. If a baby died during labor, was it because of natural causes or was the midwife negligent? If a mother bled to death, had she been cursed? If twins were born and one lived, was that a sign? The midwife had to speak carefully. Her explanations had to comfort the family, respect faith, and avoid blame. It was diplomacy wrapped in linen. The emotional labor of the midwife. Amid the practical tasks, midwives bore emotional burdens that rarely made it into records. They watched countless mothers cry in pain or grief. They buried infants. They consoled fathers. They helped name babies who would not live through the night. They wrapped tiny corpses, washed them, and whispered final blessings. Sometimes they carried secrets. Children born out of wedlock. Silent stillbirths never reported. Mothers who refused to nurse. They carried joy, two first cries, first breaths, the relief of safe delivery. Yet they never stopped moving. There was always another mother waiting. Unanswered thought, authority, or vulnerability. The midwife stood at the center of the most sacred moment in a family's life. She held, quite literally, the future in her hands. But how much power did she truly have? Was she a healer and protector, or a woman, forever one breath away from accusation? Her presence was essential, yet her position was always precarious. And what happened when male physicians, university-trained and Latin literate, began to push her aside? What became of the midwife's trade when medicine left the hearth and entered the university? The candle still burns low in the midwife's cottage, but the world beyond her door has begun to shift. Whispers from nearby towns speak of new physicians, trained in distant universities men who speak in Latin, wear long robes, and consult charts instead of checking pulses. Where the midwife once stood as the lone authority at the birthing bed, her position is no longer secure. In this second chapter, we follow the slow but seismic change in the landscape of healing. The rise of learned medicine in the later Middle Ages and Renaissance brought advances but also competition. Midwives, long the backbone of reproductive care, found their hands increasingly tied by regulation, suspicion, and the steady creep of male-dominated medical authority. This is the story of how women's healing knowledge, once passed from hand to hand, was gradually pushed aside in favor of books, credentials, and controlled access. The rise of the learned physician. By the 12th century, medical schools emerged in cities like Salerno, Bologna, Montpellier, and later Paris. There, young men trained in Galenic theory, studying the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and reading ancient authorities like Hippocrates and Avicenna. Physicians were trained in diagnosis, not hands-on care. They rarely performed surgery or attended births that was still the domain of surgeons, barber surgeons, and midwives. But the physicians brought something new: status. Their education gave them credibility in royal courts and urban councils. They wrote medical treatises, advised on public health, and slowly gained legal protections. They began to define what was true medicine and what was not. Midwives lacking formal credentials were increasingly seen as practical, but not professional. An uneven playing field. Unlike male physicians, midwives had no university training, no access to Latin texts, no guilds in most regions, at least until the early modern period, no official status in the eyes of many governments. Yet they had something more powerful: public trust. Communities continued to rely on midwives because they were accessible, affordable, and familiar. They lived among the people. They spoke the same language. They knew the mothers by name. Even as laws changed, the birth room remained largely female until complications arose. Collaboration and competition. In urban settings, especially in Italy and southern France, we see examples of midwives working alongside male surgeons or physicians. A physician might diagnose a difficult pregnancy. The midwife delivered. A barber surgeon might assist with tools during a complicated labor, but only if called. Midwives were even consulted in forensic cases, helping determine whether a birth had occurred, often in accusations of infanticide. These moments of collaboration, however, often emphasized hierarchy. The physician's voice carried legal weight, the midwife did not. In a court, her testimony could be dismissed if it contradicted a man. Gradually, even tasks once considered beneath learned physicians, like childbirth, became areas of interest. Licensing and regulation, protection or suppression. Starting in the 14th and 15th centuries, many towns and cities began issuing licenses to midwives. On paper, this seemed like a sign of recognition. In practice, it served to control. To receive a license, a midwife might have to swear loyalty to the church, pass an examination by male doctors or clerics, agree to specific fees and conduct standards, accept oversight by local authorities. Midwives without licenses were vulnerable to fines or imprisonment. The criteria were rarely consistent and often biased. Literacy might be required, though most midwives were trained orally. In some regions, these new regulations favored elite, urban women over rural or poorer practitioners, further marginalizing traditional forms of healing. Blurring the line: healing, magic, and witchcraft. As midwives became more scrutinized, their practices, especially involving herbs, charms, or superstitions, came under fire. The church, increasingly preoccupied with rooting out heresy and magic, began to question: was that herbal mixture truly medicinal or a love potion? Was that prayer simply a blessing or a spell? Did the midwife's knowledge come from God or something darker? By the late 15th century, manuals like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum linked midwifery and witchcraft. Accusations increased, though less frequently than popular imagination suggests. Still, midwives were disproportionately vulnerable to suspicion, especially if a mother or baby died. They were unmarried or lived alone. They had a reputation for strong personality or independence. The same knowledge that once made them essential now made them suspect. Testimonies from trials and church inquiries. In regions like Germany and Switzerland, surviving court records offer chilling glimpses. A midwife accused of drying up the wombs of women she disliked. Another said to have foreseen a stillbirth interpreted as a sign she caused it. One testified she learned her craft from her grandmother, an admission that oral, non-sanctioned knowledge had continued outside official channels. Even when acquitted, these women were often shunned or forced to cease practicing. What had once been a communal profession became a lonely risk. The urban-rural divide. In cities, midwives faced formal oversight and increasing competition from university-trained men. But in rural areas, where doctors rarely ventured, midwives continued to reign. They retained their local authority, adjusted to new expectations, and continued to deliver thousands of babies. Still, even in villages, midwives increasingly altered their language. They avoided visible charms. They leaned more on Christian imagery. They emphasized their oath to church and community. Adaptation became survival. Resistance and resilience. Some midwives pushed back. They formed mutual networks, sharing advice and support. They educated daughters and nieces, ensuring continuity. A few wrote down their knowledge, creating early midwifery manuals in vernacular languages. These texts, though rare, demonstrate pride in their profession and a desire to document what had long been passed orally. One such text, the Trotula, though compiled by male authors, reflects much midwifery knowledge. Later, women like Jane Sharp in the 17th century would publish works that blend traditional and modern methods. The legacy endured even as the walls closed in. An uncertain position by the late Middle Ages. By the 1500s, the midwife's world had changed. She operated under license. She deferred to male physicians. She avoided open use of herbal remedies. She defended herself constantly. Yet she continued to serve. For many women, she remained the only accessible caregiver. Her hands delivered Europe's future, even as history refused to record her name. Unresolved thought, when the experts came, who was left behind? As male medicine ascended, one question lingered. Did maternal care improve when birth was turned into a medical event, no longer a community one? Did mothers feel safer or more alone? And when the midwife was finally pushed from the room, who truly gained? The night is darker now. The fire in the cottage burns low, but there is no one beside it. Where once the midwife sat, linen bundle in hand, herbal pouch at her waist, there is only stillness. Her stool is empty, the birthroom silent. A trained physician now hovers at the bedside. His words are in Latin. His instruments are gleaming. The midwife is no longer called. She has not disappeared all at once. Her presence faded slowly, worn down by law, suspicion, and the reshaping of medicine. But with her went an entire tradition, a history of women's healing passed not through books, but bodies. In this final chapter, we trace the end of the midwife's medieval role, not as a moment of failure, but as a mirror, reflecting the changing values of a society that began to prize authority over experience, credentials over intuition, and control over care. The rise of obstetrics. Men enter the birth room. By the 16th century, a new class of practitioner emerged, the male man midwife, or accoucheur. In urban centers, especially in France and England, these men, often surgeons by training, began to offer their services in complicated births. Initially, they were called only in emergencies, when a delivery was failing and the baby's life was at risk. But over time, wealthy women began to prefer male practitioners, swayed by claims of scientific training, modern tools, and social prestige. Unlike village midwives, these men carried forceps, invented in secrecy by the Chamberlain family in 17th century England. They wore gloves. They charted progress in notebooks. They used terms like presentation, dilation, perineum. And yet their outcomes were often no better and sometimes worse. The use of instruments increased trauma. Hygiene was not yet understood, but optics mattered more than statistics. The woman who had guided generations was pushed aside for the man with the new language. Institutionalization, from hearth to hospital. In the medieval period, childbirth occurred at home, surrounded by female kin, friends, and a midwife. It was intimate, familiar, and shaped by local culture. By the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in cities, childbirth began to move toward institutional settings. Lying-in hospitals were established for poor women, run by male doctors and religious staff. Royal courts commissioned male surgeons for high-profile births, sidelining even elite midwives. Charitable maternity homes claimed to provide cleaner, safer, and moral spaces for birth. In these new settings, the social ritual of birth changed. Silence replaced storytelling, observation replaced touch, authority replaced shared experience. The midwife became a relic in her own time. From experience to examination. In the 14th century, a midwife was valued for her reputation, how many safe deliveries she had managed, how calm she remained, how trusted she was by the village. By the 17th century, trust was no longer enough. Midwives were expected to take formal exams, often before male physicians or clerics, read and understand basic Latin medical texts, swear new oaths not just religious, but legal, pay licensing fees. This shift excluded many traditional midwives, especially poor, illiterate, or rural women. Those who remained had to reshape their practices. They used medical terms. They downplayed herbal remedies. They focused on Christian decorum and compliance. The midwife became a shadow of her former self, present, but policed. Tensions within the trade, midwives versus man-midwives. By the 18th century, open tensions erupted. Midwives wrote pamphlets defending their work. Some, like Elizabeth Nihel, publicly criticized male accoucheurs, arguing that birth was a female space, not a surgical one. Nihel, a midwife trained in Paris, warned that the use of forceps often harmed mothers and babies. She ridiculed the arrogance of male practitioners who dismissed centuries of female knowledge. But hers was a rare voice. The midwife's trade had lost its institutional support. Medical schools, journals, and licensing bodies were now in male hands. She had survived through centuries of war, famine, plague, and suspicion, but not professionalization. The criminalization of traditional birth practices. With the loss of status came legal risk. Midwives, especially in rural areas, continued to rely on herbal infusions, home baptism, birth prayers or talismans, non-standard delivery techniques. These practices were now seen as dangerous, superstitious, or heretical. Accusations of malpractice or even murder became more common. Some midwives were arrested for failing to report a stillbirth. Others were tried for assisting in suspected infanticide. A few were executed, though often under charges more complex than their profession alone. The irony was bitter. Once punished for failing to save, midwives were now punished for trying at all. The vanishing of oral knowledge. Perhaps the most profound loss was not legal but cultural. For centuries, midwives passed knowledge orally. which herbs helped labor begin gently, how to ease a retained placenta, how to turn a baby with gentle pressure and patience, how to comfort a mother's heart, not just her body. These techniques, preserved by repetition and memory, were rarely written down. As the old midwives died, so too did their wisdom. What replaced it was a new form of care, measurable, teachable, male-authored. It had its merits, but it began with erasure. A final role, the midwife as witness. By the early modern period, midwives still served one crucial role: legal witness. In court cases involving rape or sexual assault, bastardy and paternity disputes, infanticide or concealed births, midwives were called upon to examine women's bodies, testify about signs of pregnancy, and describe conditions at birth. Though their role was necessary, it came with moral pressure. They were expected to uphold religious values and social norms. A sympathetic midwife could save a girl's life. A harsh one could condemn her. The healing hand became a legal instrument. Echoes and legacy. By 1700, in many parts of Europe, the independent village midwife had nearly vanished. In her place stood two alternatives: the licensed, regulated midwife, carefully monitored and often limited to low-risk births; the male physician, increasingly seen as the true authority on reproduction. Yet her legacy lived on, in the stories told by grandmothers about how they were born, in the prayers whispered by laboring women who knew no doctor was coming, in the hands of women who, without license or Latin, still caught bobbies in quiet corners of the world. Final reflection: the hands that shaped humanity. For centuries, midwives held the human race in their palms, first breath after first breath. They worked in silence, without books, without glory, often without thanks. But if you follow the chain of births backward, from your own to your grandmother's and hers, you will almost certainly find one of them. She might have worn a plain woolen dress. She might have walked through mud at midnight. She might have sung to a dying baby as she baptized it with tears. History has no statue for her, but without her, there would be no one to remember. Story 5. Merchants' wives and marketplaces. The economic power of the unseen. The scent of salted fish mixes with the aroma of spiced honey cakes. Cloth stalls ripple in the breeze. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer competes with merchants shouting in several languages. This is the medieval market square, noisy, vibrant, and essential to the economic pulse of every town. You might be looking for the merchant here, the man with the purse and ledger, but look closer. Behind the counter, checking inventory, balancing scales, and calming impatient buyers, stands a woman. She is not his assistant. She is not merely helping out. She is a merchant's wife and often a merchant herself. In the medieval economy, women like her were both indispensable and undervalued. Their labor was often categorized as domestic or supportive, yet the marketplace depended on their decisions, skills, and invisible expertise. This is their story, not told in grand voyages or royal charters, but in coin counting, contract witnessing, and the quiet strength of keeping business alive. The merchant household, a business unit. In a medieval merchant household, the home and business were not separate. The shop was usually on the ground floor. The family lived above. The kitchen served the family by day and hosted apprentices by night. The wife wove her household duties into economic tasks without clear distinction. She might measure out grain or spices, supervise the shop while her husband traveled, track credit extended to regular customers, manage correspondence with suppliers, train servants or children in trade skills. The wife was often the keeper of the keys to storerooms, cash boxes, and account books. Her trustworthiness was vital, not just emotionally but legally. Though rarely credited by name, her work was a foundational pillar of commercial survival. Trade in her name, legal and financial independence. While medieval laws varied by region, in many towns women could inherit business licenses, run shops as widows, enter contracts, join merchant or craft guilds with restrictions. In parts of Italy, France, and the Low Countries, town charters and civic records mention women conducting trade under their own names. Some were registered taxpayers. Others held official weights and measures licenses, showing their goods had passed inspection. Often, a married woman was assumed to act under her husband's authority, but widows and single women enjoyed greater legal autonomy. Widowhood, though born of loss, could be an unexpected path to economic agency. Records from Ghent, Bruges, and Paris show women dealing in cloth and textiles, wine and ale, bread and grains, second-hand goods, luxury imports like silk or pepper. They bartered, haggled loan money, and sued over unpaid debts. Managing risk, credit, debt, and investment. Commerce involved risk, and women were not exempt. The merchant's wife had to track who owed what, know which suppliers gave fair weight, manage perishable stock, decide when to invest in more goods and when to wait. In many cases, she was the bookkeeper. The family ledger might be written in vernacular rather than Latin, accessible to her. Her calculations determined whether the household remained solvent through lean months or plague seasons. When a ship was delayed or a shipment ruined, it was often the wife who reorganized the local accounts to make ends meet. She was not protected by guild prestige, but by her reputation, a fragile but powerful currency. Markets and gender, the informal economy. Beyond the formal shop, women thrived in markets, fairs, and informal economies. They sold cheese, butter, and milk from their own animals, wool yarn spun at home, homegrown herbs and vegetables, worn clothing and household items. These transactions weren't always recorded, but they formed the bedrock of local exchange. In many towns, women dominated open-air markets, especially in food and small goods. Market records from English towns like York and Winchester list women regularly fined for selling underweight bread, disrupting stalls, selling bad ale. These infractions reveal presence, not failure. A fine meant you were in the game. The invisible apprenticeship. Young girls in merchant families learned by doing. They watched mothers measure and weigh, learned how to haggle respectfully, helped prepare goods for market, kept household accounts as practice. Daughters were often trained to be commercially competent wives. Even if they didn't inherit a shop, they might marry into another merchant family and carry that knowledge forward. Some guilds allowed female apprentices, especially in textiles, food trade, and clothing. These apprenticeships often occurred informally within households, creating a quiet network of skill sharing among women. Networks of women traders. Women often supported one another, trading goods, favors, and information. These networks functioned parallel to official male-dominated guilds. A merchant's wife might refer customers to her friend's stall. A widow might rent out shop space to a younger woman starting out. Women formed bonds of credit and trust, based on reputation rather than contract. While not formalized, these relationships enabled survival, especially in competitive or unstable markets. And during crises, war, famine, or epidemic, these support systems became lifelines. Religion, morality, and commerce. As with many medieval women, the merchant's wife navigated expectations of Christian morality. The church warned against greed, deceit, and usury. Women in trade were often scrutinized. Were they pricing fairly? Were they cheating weights? Were they being too ambitious? Piety offered protection. Many merchant households sponsored masses, donated to local churches, or gave alms. Women displayed religious images in shops and homes, wore devotional badges, and funded prayers for deceased relatives. Balancing profit and piety was delicate, but for many, it was essential to legitimacy. When the merchant did not return, travel in the medieval world was dangerous. Merchants might die abroad of illness, shipwreck, or violence. When that happened, the wife stepped fully into his role. She might inform business partners, settle debts, continue the shop or sell it, petition local courts for inheritance rights. Many women not only maintained businesses after their husbands' deaths, but expanded them. In the 14th century records of Florence and Cologne, widows appear frequently as tax-paying merchants in their own right, especially in the cloth and garment trades. Widowhood, while tragic, often unlocked economic autonomy previously denied. Unresolved thought, backbone or shadow. The merchant's wife was everywhere, measuring cloth, tracking shipments, calming customers, baking loaves, keeping books. Yet her name was rarely recorded, her face almost never drawn, her story passed only through ledgers and fines and 1,000 whispered transactions. So we ask, was she the backbone of medieval commerce, or merely its shadow? When markets shifted, guilds closed, or men returned from journeys to reclaim control, did she fade from view? Or did she simply shift again, as she always had, to where she was most needed? The morning mist curls through the stone alleyways of a bustling town. Merchants begin to unbolt their shutters. Apprentices sweep the dust from flagstones. And inside a narrow shop by candlelight, a woman checks her ledger. She counts the week's takings, measures cloth from a fresh bolt, reviews a letter from a distant supplier. Her husband may be away on business, or perhaps he died some winters ago. Either way, she is in control, yet the town registry lists only a man's name over the door. In this section, we explore how women in the medieval merchant class exercised authority without recognition. They negotiated contracts, worked within or around guilds, and served as the silent machinery behind commerce. Though rarely recorded, their influence shaped entire economic systems. The contractual mindset, women's legal literacy. Contrary to assumptions about medieval illiteracy, many merchant women, especially in towns, were functionally literate, particularly in the vernacular, the local spoken and written language. They needed to be. Household accounts had to be kept, inventories tracked, credit arrangements remembered, contracts read and honored. While they often relied on scribes for official documents, many women knew how to read receipts, count change, and understand debt agreements. Some women even witnessed contracts in court, particularly when acting as co-heirs or as business successors to their husbands. Legal records from 14th century Paris and London show women suing over unpaid debts, appearing as plaintiffs and defendants, and swearing oaths in commercial disputes. They may not have written the law, but they understood how to use it. Guilds, gateways, or gatekeepers. Guilds were powerful institutions in medieval towns. They regulated prices, training, product quality, and professional conduct. Membership brought prestige but also protection and oversight. Women's relationship to guilds was complex. In some cities, especially in the Low Countries and Italy, women could be members in their own right, especially in textiles, brewing, and food trades. In others, especially in England and parts of France, they could only join through husbands or fathers, often listed as wife of. Some guilds permitted widows to continue their husband's business, provided they employed a licensed journeyman or passed an exam. Female guild members were often found in cloth finishing and weaving, ale and beer brewing, baking and pastry making, butchery in some German towns, midwifery and healing in rare guild forms. These positions were usually on the lower rungs of commercial hierarchy, but they offered some formal recognition and a shield against legal vulnerability. The widow's clause, inheritance and interim authority. A common legal protection across Europe was the widow's clause in guild regulations or merchant contracts. When a merchant died, his wife could inherit his shop, tools, or stall license, complete any existing contracts, employ apprentices or journeymen to carry on the business, apply for a limited-term license to continue operations. In some places, this privilege lasted for a year, in others for life. Records from Bruges, Florence, and Lubeck show widows not just managing but thriving in inherited businesses. Some expanded inventory, diversified goods, or passed the enterprise on to daughters. These women navigated guild rules while avoiding dependency. Though technically placeholders, they often became de facto masters of their craft. Social credit, reputation as currency. In towns where official recognition was limited, women relied heavily on reputation, a concept as binding as any written contract. A woman known for fair measuring, prompt debt repayment, quality goods, honest dealings, could attract loyal customers and stable suppliers. Breaking this trust, however, was costly. Gossip spread quickly. Markets punished deceit informally. A woman accused of price gouging or watered-down ale might see her business vanish overnight. Women, therefore, cultivated networks of reliability, knowing that in the absence of formal status, their word and conduct were all they had. Marriage contracts and economic clout. Merchant marriages were often business arrangements as much as emotional unions. Before marriage, contracts might specify dowries, cash, land, or trade goods, control of shop inventory, division of profit, which assets belong to the wife independently, important in cases of debt or legal claims. These clauses, negotiated by families, could secure a woman's continued income even if widowed or abandoned. In some regions, like southern France or Catalonia, wives retained ownership of their dowry investment, allowing them to reclaim it or pass it to daughters. Thus, women entered marriage with financial tools and often helped choose the shape of the family enterprise. Training the next generation, female economic education. Behind every bustling shop or market stall, a household economy was quietly in motion. Girls born into merchant families learned how to prepare goods for sale, the difference between wholesale and retail, how to handle rude customers, how to calculate change on the fly, how to detect spoiled flour or diluted one. This apprenticeship by immersion was rarely formal, but it shaped generations of commercial competence. When these girls married, they brought that competence into new households, spreading trade knowledge across cities and regions. The hidden trade, female entrepreneurship outside the guilds. While guilds offered protection, they also imposed restrictions. Many women, especially single, lower-class, or foreign-born, worked outside guild structures, often at the edge of legality. These women sold second-hand clothes, acted as moneylenders or pawnbrokers, brewed ale at home, offered tailoring or mending services, made candles or soap. They were often fined for illicit trade, yet records show them returning again and again. Their perseverance reveals the persistence of female entrepreneurship, even when not officially sanctioned. The medieval economy needed their flexibility, but rarely rewarded their presence. Gendered language in the marketplace. Language shaped perception. A man was a merchant. A woman might be wife of a merchant, even if she ran the shop. A man employed staff. A woman helped at home. This linguistic bias concealed labor. It painted women's work as supplementary, even when it was foundational. In some places, however, women pushed back. In civic petitions, court cases, and church records, women began to assert, "I sold the goods. I kept the accounts. I pay the taxes. These small claims of authorship mattered. They whispered a history not yet written. Unresolved thought, hidden in the books or hidden by them. The merchant's wife kept the books, balanced the accounts, negotiated prices, taught her daughters, paid her debts, inherited the stall, held the keys. Yet when the history of commerce is told, her name is rarely spoken. Was she hidden in the ledgers or hidden by them? What would we learn if we rewrote trade history from her side of the counter? The medieval marketplace may have been dominated by men's voices in charters, ledgers, and guild halls, but the silent labor, intuition, and negotiation of women kept its rhythms intact. As we step into this final section, we trace the long view, how the role of merchants, wives, and women in trade more broadly transformed, contracted, and eventually disappeared from the historical narrative, even as their contributions shaped European commerce. This story doesn't end with a fall from power or a single catastrophe, but with a gradual erasure by normalization. As the economy professionalized and masculinized, women's presence was not outlawed, it was simply no longer written down. What remains are the traces, in disputes, receipts, wills, and fines. These quiet indicators tell a louder story than the official record ever did. The early modern shift, guild centralization and exclusion. As Europe entered the early modern period, 15th-17th centuries, the merchant economy evolved. Towns expanded. Overseas trade intensified. New industries like printing, banking, and large-scale textiles emerged. With these changes came a push for centralized control. Guilds, once localized and occasionally flexible, tightened membership criteria. Formal apprenticeships became longer and more expensive. Latin literacy and written contracts became essential. Proof of male citizenship and lineage became a requirement. Married women were increasingly excluded or barred from practicing without male supervision. Women's informal, domestic contributions had no place in this new landscape. Commerce was now a profession, and women were unofficially unprofessional. Even in trades like brewing or textiles, once dominated by women, guild regulations rewrote the rules in men's favor. Moral and religious reforms, piety and the proper woman. The Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation both emphasized a moral vision of gender roles. The obedient wife, the industrious but quiet homemaker, the woman focused on piety rather than profit. In sermons, popular literature, and civic codes, women were urged to stay in the domestic sphere, avoid public argument or litigation, support their husbands' businesses but not take credit, avoid the risks and temptations of money handling. Though many still worked out of necessity, these changing norms redefined visibility as immodesty. A woman with her own stall or employees might be seen as overreaching or unfeminine. The merchant's wife could still keep the books, but increasingly, she was expected to do so quietly. Economic survival versus historical silence. Despite these pressures, women persisted in trade, especially among widows, single women, lower-class urban laborers, immigrant and minority communities, e.g., Jewish or Lombard traders. They ran inns, lent money, brewed ale, stitched clothing, baked bread, and sold goods in informal markets. But their work, essential to urban survival, was rarely recorded in official histories. They were not part of the banking elite, nor patrons of cathedrals. They were not celebrated as founders or pioneers. Their businesses may have been small-scale, but they were the backbone of local economies. The disappearance of a role, not a reality. By the 18th century, the term merchant's wife had shifted in tone. Once a functional partner, she was now seen as a passive social role, a woman of status, wealth, and domestic refinement. But this change in language didn't reflect an absence of work. Rather, it was the domestication of visibility. The actual labor remained. Women still managed inventories, still supervised staff, still coordinated logistics in family businesses, still carried knowledge passed down through generations. Yet the new ideal was the idle woman, the decorative figure behind the successful man. The ledgers she once wrote in were now labeled under his name. It was not her presence that changed, only the light by which history chose to see her. Personal testimonies and probate records. Some of the most vivid glimpses of these women come not from chronicles or guild rolls, but from wills, where women bequeath tools of trade or business shares; dowry contracts listing commercial goods and debts; court petitions, where women defend their right to a shop or reclaim unpaid sums; inventories, recording the full stock of a household store after death. In a 15th century inventory from Lubeck, a widow's estate includes bolts of dyed wool, balances and scales, a handwritten account ledger, a note on outstanding debts from clients. In every item is a whisper: I was here, I worked, I remembered. Networks that outlived names. What's remarkable is how women maintained invisible institutions alongside official ones. They built informal networks of credit and loan, apprenticeship and mentorship, product sourcing and information sharing, emotional support and child care. These webs held the city together in ways guilds could not. They offered flexibility, empathy, and shared risk. But they lacked archival weight. No seal, no charter, no central office. So they vanished from history books, even though they shaped every market, fair, and feast day. What we lost in losing her. With the erasure of the merchant's wife came the loss of oral traditions of practical business knowledge, collaborative models of spousal partnerships, intergenerational economic education for daughters, localized trust-based credit systems led by women, and perhaps most of all, the reminder that economies are human. They are built not only by conquest, charter, and taxation, but by long hours, quiet choices, and domestic expertise. The market square without her is less vibrant. The shop without her voice is less welcoming. The trace in us today. Every small business run from a kitchen table. Every woman tracking receipts and suppliers from home. Every daughter learning the ropes beside her mother. Every whispered loan or neighborly barter is a faint echo of the merchant's wife. You will not find her in your history textbook, but you will find her wherever survival and dignity were earned, not inherited. Her name may be lost, but her shadow still walks the marketplace. Final reflection: the weight of an unwritten ledger. When historians ask where women were in the medieval economy, the answer is simple: everywhere. But if we ask why they seem absent, we must look at the ledgers, not just what was written in them, but who held the quill. The merchant's wife was there, recording inventory by candlelight, weighing fabric, paying bills, extending credit, coaching apprentices, calming customers. She was the ledger, she was the hand, she was the reason. And maybe someday the page will turn back to her. Story 6: The spiritual journeys of medieval women. Before the age of passports and trains, before maps were accurate or safe lodgings guaranteed, there were women who walked. They walked across fields and forests, through towns and kingdoms, over mountains and rivers. They carried little, perhaps a cloak, a prayer book, a scrap of relic cloth sewn into a pouch. And in their hearts they carried intentions for healing, for penance for a lost child, a guilty conscience, a vow made in fear or hope. These were the medieval women pilgrims. Not abbesses or queens alone, but wives, widows, peasant girls, tradeswomen, nuns, and repentant sinners, all setting out on journeys of devotion. Their steps are mostly absent from chronicles. Their prayers were not recorded in illuminated manuscripts, but they left behind footprints scattered in church records, miracle tales, donation lists, and whispered legend. In this section, we follow them from hearth to holy road, uncovering how ordinary women participated in and shaped the vibrant tradition of medieval pilgrimage. What was a pilgrimage? A pilgrimage was a journey made to a sacred site, usually one associated with a saint's relics, a reported miracle, a shrine or holy well, a scene from Christ's life or passion. Popular destinations included Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, Thomas Becket's shrine, Rome and Jerusalem for those who could afford the danger. Local saints, tombs scattered across Europe, like St. Winfried in Wales or St. Hildegard in Germany. Pilgrimage could be voluntary or ordered by a priest or court as penance. It might be undertaken for healing from illness, intercession for a loved one, penance after a crime or sin, thanksgiving for answered prayers. And while men often walked for honor or knightly duty, women's reasons were more intimate, more bodily: childbirth, barrenness, mourning, family ruin. Who were the women pilgrims? We often imagine pilgrims as monks or armored knights, but most were ordinary people and many were women. Types of women pilgrims included peasant women hopping to cure a child's illness or bring luck to the harvest, wives seeking a safe childbirth or intercession for their husbands' souls, widows fulfilling vows made with their deceased spouse, nuns allowed temporary leave from convents, sinners sent by court to expiate adultery, theft, or gossip. In England and France, tax records and court rolls refer to women granted permits or licenses to travel to holy sites. Many traveled in groups for safety and companionship. Others joined mixed pilgrim bands with strangers. Though their names are rarely recorded, miracle books mention a woman from Devon, a weaver's daughter from Liege, or a grieving mother from Toulouse. Each had a story. We are left only the faint outlines. Preparations and permissions. Unlike male pilgrims, women needed permission from husbands, guardians, or religious superiors. Married women were expected to get their husband's consent, not always given. Unmarried women needed family or priestly approval. Nuns required formal leave from their order. Widows had the most freedom. Many used this stage of life to fulfill spiritual promises. To prepare, they might arrange childcare or household management, gather coins or sell goods for travel expenses, sew or buy pilgrim garb, a cloak, staff, and badge space, consult local clergy for blessings and guidance. Some joined guilds or confraternities of pilgrims, which offered safety and spiritual fellowship. Despite these precautions, the road was perilous, especially for women, yet they went. On the road, dangers, customs, and camaraderie. The journey itself could take weeks, months, even years, depending on the destination. Women pilgrims faced bandits and extortion on remote roads, inadequate lodgings or unwanted advances at inns, language barriers and unfamiliar customs, illness, injury, and fatigue. They traveled by foot, donkey, or occasionally boat. Wealthier women might ride in carts or join caravan-style groups. Yet records show that many found community on the road, shared prayers around campfires, singing hymns during long walks, mutual aid in times of injury or loss, religious rituals at way stations and chapels. A pilgrimage was not only a journey to a shrine, but a temporary escape from gender roles, household burdens, or sin's weight. On the road, a woman was not just a wife or servant, she was a penitent, a seeker, a traveler. Arrival at the feet of the saint. After weeks or months of travel, the woman pilgrim would arrive at the shrine. There she might kneel at a tomb or relic box, touch or kiss the stone believed to hold healing power, make a donation, coin, candle, garment, purchase a souvenir badge as proof of completion, sleep within the church for incubation, healing. Pilgrimage accounts and miracle books describe women healed of lameness, barrenness, madness, or grief after touching a saint's relic. Others sought answers not for their own healing, but for a child, a spouse, a lost soul. At some sites, she might leave behind tokens: a braid of hair, a strip of cloth, a written prayer tied to trees, laid on altars, dropped in wells. And sometimes nothing happened, no miracle, just a long walk home. Still, she had done what she vowed. That was enough. Unresolved thought: why did she walk? The world told her to stay home, tend hearth, serve others. Yet she walked across kingdoms. Was it faith that drove her, or desperation? Hope or guilt? Healing, or simply the desire to move, to be part of something larger than her small, invisible life? And when she returned sunburned, footsore, poorer than before, was she transformed? Or did she slip back into daily life as if she had never left? What did the road give her that no one else ever would? The shrine is silent but for the shuffle of tired feet and whispered prayers. Wax smoke curls around carved saints. Candles flicker beside scraps of cloth tied to rails, offerings from the desperate. A woman kneels by a relic, head bowed. No one speaks to her, yet everyone sees her. She is one of many, and she is utterly alone. This section explores the most powerful aspect of pilgrimage for women: the act of seeking divine intervention for the body and often the soul. Whether for healing, fertility, protection, or atonement, women pilgrims brought deeply personal physical and emotional needs to holy sites. These sacred journeys weren't simply about religious duty. They were about ownership of one's body and fate in a world where both were often controlled by others. Women's bodies, women's prayers. In medieval society, the female body was seen as mysterious, unstable, and morally suspect. Menstruation, childbirth, infertility, and hysteria were misunderstood. Women were often blamed for illness, miscarriage, or spiritual weakness. Access to medical care was limited, and healing knowledge often controlled by male clerics. For many women, pilgrimage became a last resort, a chance to ask God or a saint to intervene where midwives, priests, or physicians could not. Common reasons women sought pilgrimage: infertility or repeated miscarriage, unending bleeding or female ailments, mental distress or hallucinations, injuries from childbirth, mysterious or chronic illness. Healing wasn't guaranteed, but pilgrimage offered hope, ritual, and a kind of bodily autonomy, even if only temporarily. Miracle tales and their implications. Many pilgrimage sites kept miracle books, accounts of healings attributed to the saint. These were recorded by clerics, but often based on pilgrims' verbal testimonies. Examples include: a woman from Norwich healed of infertility after touching Thomas Becket's shrine. A peasant girl from Aquitaine cured of seizures at the shrine of Saint Foy. A midwife from Bruges released from chronic bleeding after visiting a Marian shrine. These stories typically followed a pattern: description of suffering or sin, journey to the shrine, contact with relic or saint, instant or delayed healing, return home with a vow to give thanks. However, women's voices are filtered through male scribes. The narratives often emphasize divine mercy, not the woman's own decision-making or bravery. Still, these miracle stories hint at something powerful: a world in which women took action for their own well-being, even if history tried to credit others. Healing practices at shrines. Healing wasn't passive. Women engaged in rituals, many of which blended Christian doctrine with older folk practices. Common actions included: sleeping near or on the saint's tomb, drinking or bathing in holy water, anointing afflicted body parts with oil or dust from the shrine, tying cloth to sacred trees or fences, whispering prayers into stone wishing holes or wells. Many women brought tokens representing their ailment: wax models of breasts, wombs, eyes, or limbs. These were left at the shrine as physical prayers. The practice was especially common at Marian shrines, where the Virgin's motherly compassion was seen as accessible and tender, something a suffering woman could relate to deeply. Pilgrimage as penitence, the body as witness. Not all pilgrimage was for healing. Many women walked as penance sent by priests, husbands, or courts for adultery or sexual transgression, abortion or infanticide, blasphemy, theft, or gossip, breaking vows or suspected witchcraft. For these women, the journey was a public and physical form of repentance. They might be required to walk barefoot or wear sackcloth, display signs identifying their sin, fast or sleep in harsh conditions, carry heavy crosses or symbolic burdens. The body, once the site of sin, became the site of redemption. Each blister was proof of contrition. Each mile walked was a step back towards social acceptance. Yet even in this, there was agency. By enduring the pilgrimage, the woman reclaimed part of her narrative. She made the road a confessional and the shrine a place of renewal. Fertility, birth, and the female saint. Few concerns were as constant and as dangerous for medieval women as childbearing. Infant mortality was high. Complications from childbirth were deadly. Barrenness was shameful and often punished. Women frequently traveled to shrines known for aiding fertility and safe delivery. Some saints became specialists. St. Margaret of Antioch, whose legend included being swallowed by a dragon and emerging alive, was invoked for safe childbirth. St. Anne, Mother of Mary, was asked for intercession by barren women. St. Bridget of Ireland, though never canonized formally, was associated with healing womb ailments. Many shrines offered birthing girdles, lengths of cloth or rope touched to relics, then worn around the abdomen during labor. Others gave pilgrims birthing stones to be held or placed near the birthing bed. These items weren't magical. They were tangible expressions of hope, trust, and tradition. When the miracles didn't come, not all women returned home healed. Some died en route, their bones buried in foreign soil. Others found no change in their illness or sorrow. Some were met with disbelief or ridicule upon return. Yet even these journeys had meaning. The pilgrimage offered space to grieve or reflect, time away from oppressive households, spiritual companionship with others in suffering, a way to fulfill a vow, even if the result was silence. In a world where many women's choices were constrained, the simple act of walking, praying, hopping, was itself an act of faith and quiet defiance. Unresolved thought, did she find what she sought? She lit the candle, she kissed the relic, she slept by the tomb and drank from the well. She whispered the name of her lost child, or her broken body, or the future she still dared to want. Was she answered? Or was the true miracle that she went at all? What did it mean to return home unchanged in body, but altered in spirit? The shrine fades behind her. The path home winds ahead, familiar and unknown. Her feet ache. Her purse is lighter, but something in her step has changed. She carries no relic, no miracle to boast of, just the memory of her journey and perhaps the quiet conviction that she has fulfilled her promise. This final section examines what happened when women pilgrims returned, how their journeys were remembered or forgotten, what legacies they left, and how the act of pilgrimage, though often undocumented, left deep impressions on the medieval world. The return, reintegration, and recognition. Upon completing a pilgrimage, men might receive honor, land, or titles, especially if they visited Jerusalem or Rome. For women, the return was more ambiguous. How a woman was received depended on the nature of her pilgrimage, voluntary or penitential, her social status, whether she returned healed or changed in a visible way, the beliefs of her community and parish priest. If her pilgrimage was linked to penance, she might be restored to the church's good graces. If undertaken for healing, she could be praised for her faith. But often, especially for poor or unmarried women, she slipped back into daily life without public acknowledgement. Her inner transformation, if any, was hers alone to hold. Pilgrim badges, memory worn on the body. Pilgrims often brought home badges, cheap lead or tin emblems, stamped with the image of the saint or shrine. For example, a scallop shell from Santiago de Compostela, a small sword or archbishop's mitre from Canterbury, a cross or fleur-de-lis from Parisian shrines. Women wore them pinned to cloaks, belts, or hats. These badges served as proof of completion, spiritual protection. Some believed they warded off future illness. Conversation starters in their community. Heirlooms passed on to children or buried with the wearer. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of these badges across Europe, in fields, rivers, and graves. Each one is a silent testament. I walked, I prayed, I believed. Pilgrim testimonies, the unheard voices. Unlike monks or knights, few women pilgrims left written accounts. Literacy was limited, and most women's stories were never considered worth recording. Still, we find their voices indirectly. In miracle books, where they appear as subjects of healing. In court records, when they testify about events witnessed on pilgrimage. In wills, where they mention visiting a saint's shrine or leaving gifts in gratitude. In folklore, where tales of the holy woman who traveled far echo down generations. Some rare exceptions exist. For instance, the 15th century Englishwoman Margery Kempe dictated her spiritual autobiography, including multiple pilgrimages. Her story is exceptional not because she traveled, but because her voice survives. Most women walked without ever expecting history to remember them. Community impact, pilgrimage as social capital. For some women, a completed pilgrimage elevated their standing in the local community. They might become advisors on spiritual matters, healers or midwives with added authority, founders or patrons of local chapels or shrines, respected figures among other women. Others used their pilgrim status to build religious networks, joining confraternities or financing altar candles, prayer books, or mass donations. Their contribution was spiritual, not economic, but it rippled outward, shaping local piety. In quiet ways, women pilgrims helped feminize devotional culture, emphasizing the personal, the tender, the physical. Pilgrimage in widowhood and legacy. Widowhood was often the most liberating phase of a woman's life in medieval Europe. Freed from marital obligations, some widows chose to go on longer pilgrimages, even to Rome or Jerusalem, found religious houses or donate to convents, commission altarpieces or stained glass honoring saints they had visited, be buried with their pilgrim gear, staff, badge, cloak. Their wills reflect these choices. A widow in York left money for a new candle at Becket's shrine. Another in Ghent specified that her girdle, touched at the shrine of St. Livinus, be buried with her. Through these acts, pilgrimage became part of how women shaped their spiritual legacy, not through power or property, but through memory and devotion. Pilgrimage in the imagination, stories passed on. Even women who never traveled knew pilgrimage through relative stories, chapel paintings and relic exhibitions, parish sermons and miracle tales, folk songs and dramatic reenactments. Pilgrimage became a cultural memory, handed down through generations. A daughter might grow up hearing of her mother's healing at a shrine. A granddaughter might inherit a badge. A young girl might whisper a prayer to a saint her aunt once walked 100 miles to thank. Even when the roads were too dangerous or society too restrictive, the image of the woman pilgrim lingered, walking with purpose, praying with fire, believing against all odds. The slow decline of the female pilgrim. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, pilgrimage as a religious practice began to decline. Reasons included the Protestant Reformation, which criticized pilgrimage as superstitious, increased state control over travel and religious practice, the commercialization of shrines, which drew ire from reformers, plagues and wars, which made long journeys unsafe. With this decline, the woman pilgrim became a relic herself. She vanished from church rolls, from roadways, from miracle books. She became a shadow in memory, remembered more in story than in presence. But that memory persisted, it still does. Final reflection: the woman who walked for no one but herself. She may have walked for her child, her sins, her aching body, or her village. But somewhere along the dusty road, the reason changed. She walked because it was hers to do, a decision made in a world where few were hers to make. And in walking, she rewrote what it meant to be a woman of faith, not silent, not still, but in motion, seeking, praying, remembering. We don't know her name, but we walk in the shadow of her footprints,